borrowed from the title by Diana Laurilard's 2002 book, Rethinking University Teaching. And, you know, we've been presented with this amazing opportunity. We had to do something really, really quick to respond to this incredible situation we found ourselves in. And I think it sort of behoves us to now go back and think about what it was we did, whether it was effective, and, you know, how we're going to go forward. So that's the kind of thing I'll be looking at today. Caroline, I might have to get you to move my slides on because I don't seem to be able to do that for some reason. Okay, there we go. So this was our challenge. We found that we had suddenly to change the way we were expected to deliver pre-sessional English, and it happened really, really quickly. And in my case, it was prompted by the IELTS centres in China closing, and all of a sudden my university colleagues realised that no student was going to be able to meet their English condition, and the spotlight swung round for them to recognise they actually have an English section at Heriot-Watt University, and it became an enormous potential for me to raise the internal profile of pre-sessional English at the institution, where it's continued to enjoy you know, much more publicity than it ever has before. So that was really positive. But I think it's going to take a little while for me to move these slides on. I'll go to the next one if I can. That's good. So what we were having to do was move from face-to-face teaching to being able to teach online. And, you know, we've all been using technology for teaching, but it's a big leap to use only technology for teaching. And we really need to think about a different way of designing our programs and thinking about how to teach online. So moving to the next slide. Some people were more ready than others. So I participated in a critical evaluation of the Open University EAP course quite some time ago. And then Coventry University Pre-sessional Online started in 2018. So they were well placed to understand what they were doing. But I want to pay tribute to the BALEAP discussion list and BALEAP colleagues, because they were hugely supportive and a very generous community to share experiences and approaches early on. And I benefited enormously from the discussions that were going on there. So let's move to the next slide. So here I'm going to talk about materials I made available in advance, which are on my blog. And they're based on a lesson from the coursebook Access EAP Frameworks, which is the one we use. It's a lesson on writer's voice. I'll talk a little bit more about it later on, but I'm not going into the detail of it. So what I'm going to do is have a brief explanation of the course design in my context, and then look at theories that might support reflection. So I'm not focusing on technical issues and the dynamics of online classroom. And I'd point you to David Reed's very insightful posts, again on the BALEAP discussion list. I've just listed the first of 3 here, because those are really helpful for reflecting on the actual technology of online teaching. So moving to the next slide. So in my view, the medium is not the message. The online platform as a means of delivery is not a driver of course design or teaching methodology. And so the sort of questions we can ask ourselves about our courses, and which I'm asking about the ones that I've designed: how well does your course design support learning? And a big question is, are you actually teaching something, or are you mainly practicing skills? That's worth asking that. Then how well does your course design support transfer to degree studies? Is it easy for students to see that what they're doing in pre-sessional is what they'll be doing in their degree? And then a big one for me was, how well do your teachers understand your course design principles? So my intended outcome today, I'm not saying here's how you design a course. You've got to do that for yourself in your own context. What I'm saying is, here's some ways to think about your context and the courses you've designed in terms of more general theories of education. So I'm very much linking theory to practice, and I'm at the practice end of that. So next slide. So here's a little bit of feedback from one of the teachers, and it's important to say nothing works perfectly first time round, and this teacher felt disadvantaged by the way that we'd set up our materials. The collaborate and preparation slides were the materials, and this teacher was made to feel and appear to be superfluous in his or her eyes and thought of themselves as effectively a biological answer key. So of course that wasn't the intention, but the design of the course prevented this teacher from teaching effectively, and we didn't explain sufficiently well the underlying principles and how to use the materials that we'd set up. So on to the next slide. So my underlying principles in practice come actually from very early experience with Sue Argent and Jennifer Spencer designing an EAP course for independent distance learners at Heriot-Watt in 2001-3 to support external programs, which were distance learning paper-based programs at that time. And out of that activity, which was based on exploration of a corpus of 1 million business management words, out of that came EAP Essentials, and it's Chapter 3 course design that's underpinning this talk. And then Sue and I felt that if we were going to say these are the EAP principles, we should put them into practice. And so we wrote together Access EAP Foundations and Frameworks, 2 course book series, which said, well, those were the principles and here's what we think they would look like in a classroom. So the book is a task-based and scenario-based course book. It proved to be relatively easy to adapt for online delivery, and it has exemplar students as case studies. So the book tells their stories, tells the stories of their academic journeys and the challenges they face as they negotiate through a system at a virtual university. So over to the next slide. Good, thank you. So our EAP principles are EAP. It is about language. Some people have said, oh, it's just about skills. It's not. It's definitely about language. So we made our learning outcomes the CEFR B2 descriptors because that's where we had to get to for entry to degrees. So those were learning outcomes for language, but it's also about academic performance, and that's contextualized within academic content and scholarship. So that's the graduate attributes, the qualities and attributes you acquire by studying a degree. An example is research mindedness. So in Access EAP frameworks, those form the high level organising principle. Each of the units focuses on a particular graduate attribute. But then it's also about purposes, and for me that purpose is driven by assessment. Students are very focused on assessment, and so we try to make our assessment tasks simulations of authentic academic genres, and we ask the students to choose the concepts they want to research for all the coursework they do. And so we don't give them topics, and we don't ask lecturers what topics we should give them. We just simply say to the students, what are you curious about? What are you interested in exploring? So over to the next slide, please. So what you can see in the picture is a simulator for training airline pilots, and it's so authentic that the only thing it doesn't do is take off and land. And I wanted to make our academic assessment simulate as closely as possible the real experience of doing assessments, doing coursework at university, so that the transfer could be so much easier. So we give them the labels that lecturers use for their coursework: annotated bibliography, literature review, and we mirror academic communication because academics don't actually get together for 20 hours a week, certainly not with students and not with each other. And most of their communication is asynchronous and via text. It's not via face-to-face. So we use the Blackboard platform and the discussion board and blog within that platform for peer interaction. So there's a lot of asynchronous formative assessment on the program. Over to the next slide, thank you. So this is a little definition of flipped learning. It comes from 2013, so it's mainly thinking about how can computer technology support the flipped classroom? But the key thing I want to take from here is what you've got to decide is what you absolutely need a human for, and what sorts of things can be done by a computer and perhaps in groups of peers. So next slide, please. So my design principles, which we shared with the teachers at induction, but induction is always a very busy time and they won't necessarily remember everything. But we were talking about materials-driven flipped learning. The course book was at the heart of the program, and we bridged the course book to the online synchronous lessons, 50-minute lessons for each course, with voiceover PowerPoint presentations. So when I talk about the preparation PowerPoint, that's what we gave to students, and we said you need to study this for 3 hours at least in advance to prepare for your online sessions. But I found myself saying the same things that somebody had said to me back in 1900 Oatcake when I did my CELTA. These were the 2 things that people said: keep it simple, don't let the technology become the focus of your lessons. And lots of people were saying, oh, we can do this, we can do that, we can use this app, we can use that app. And really what we wanted to be doing was focusing on the teaching. And then don't waste your students' time. So focus on the key learning outcomes, because if you've only got a 50-minute synchronous class, what you've got to be doing is the most important thing that there is to do, and you don't have a lot of other time to do things. So you can't do the sorts of typical activities that a teacher would do: set up tasks, discuss in pairs, share with the class, and generally have that sort of interaction. And instead, what you need to do is concept check, see if they've done the preparation, if they understand what they've been looking at. Teach as new, in other words, teach the concepts as if they haven't been seen before, but only if necessary. Don't teach if the students already understand. And then, most important, I think, provide metacognitive summaries and links to the assessment so the students can pull it all together and understand where they're going and how they might transfer. Show the answers and have a discussion about why these are the answers, and then really crucial, focus on the metacognitive aspects. And there's a good article by Letitia Mombeck, 2018, to think about transfer, and she really nailed it in that article. You know, I'd been thinking about transfer a lot, and it was so clear for me. So I recommend that you do read that one. So moving to the next slide. So some of the issues that we came across, and a colleague who works now at Stirling but used to work with me in a different discipline said, don't make your synchronous sessions learning critical, because we experienced a lot of technical issues. Students often couldn't access these in real time. They were dropping out, coming back in again. So I felt the main purpose of the synchronous session was to try to build a class community of practice where the students wanted to work together in the asynchronous peer-to-peer activities to support each other. But that created a key issue with teacher identity. Many of the teachers were unhappy with this lack of face-to-face teaching. They felt that the essential engagement with students was lost. And as we saw from the quote at the beginning, some teachers felt designed out of the course and were really uncertain about their role. And then, of course, we experienced a problem about teacher knowledge. So teachers new to the program, and even some more experienced teachers, didn't actually fully understand the concepts they were teaching. So moving to the next slide. So what I want to do now is just very briefly, and I'll try and make it as brief as possible, introduce some of the theories of learning that have informed my thinking and my reflection over the years and more recently. And these are theories of learning. They're not theories of language learning. So I'm not introducing second language acquisition, because I've always felt that we ought to get out a bit more. We need to step outside our own little box, and we need to have a look and see what other people are talking about. And as I mentioned earlier, I really found Dial and Laurie Lard's work really useful in thinking about designs. She was talking in 2002 about how you can learn with and through technology. She worked at the Open University. She did a lot of empirical studies there, looking at how students learn, and she came up with the learning conversation I'll talk about in a minute. And then just by chance, I happened to be reading New Scientist, and I came across Grasp by Sama and Yukinto, The Science Transforming How We Learn. Really recommend this. It's a monograph which traces the history of learning theories, and it's really insightful in helping you to think about what learning really is and what it involves. And then I'm going to talk a bit about legitimation code theory, and there's some references there, which is a sociological theory of knowledge, which tries to explain how people become experts and how they teach others. And I'm going to look at semantic gravity mainly and semantic density, which are two of the toolkits which enable you to analyze what's going on in your materials and in your classroom interactions, and to what extent this promotes knowledge building. Okay, next slide, please. So this is Laurelard's teaching as collaborative conversation, and I've tried to show with my not very successful arrows that this is an iterative conversation. So the teacher and student are talking together, might be face-to-face, but it might be in some other fashion, and they're becoming aware of their differences, the concept, and working together towards a shared understanding. So that's where they're going. So next slide, please, goes into a bit more detail. The talk is crucial. They've got to talk. So the student has got to talk to show that they understand. So this teacher starts on the bottom right there and explains a concept and illustrates it with a real world example and a task for the student to do. And the student shows their understanding by doing the task and getting the right answer, and then talking about what kind of thing the task is and what kind of learning they're doing. Then the teacher provides feedback on the task outcome, whether they got it right or not. Again, talking about what kind of outcome it is with this metacognitive explanation, and the student uses that feedback to change their own metacognitive understanding. So as they go through this iteration, they come to a shared understanding of the concept that the teacher is trying to help the student to understand. So over to the next slide. So the collaborative conversation, this is what Laurelard was looking at, was could it be with computers, and could peers sometimes share the tasks the teacher was involved in? Of course they can. Peers can work together to share their understanding. They can give each other feedback. The student can collaborate by completing tasks and having the metacognitive discussion, the talk about aspects of the task and about the feedback. And then feedback on some tasks can be automated by computer, and the student can use this feedback to repeat tasks or try new ones. So we said the teacher was essential, but they don't have to be the only way that the teaching goes. So next slide, please. So this is a little, very brief extract of the key points I took from this book. It's quite long and detailed, but the key things coming out of it were human-to-human education is best. But if we, in the absence of being able to have that one-to-one learning, that learning by sitting with a more experienced person and watching them, that legitimate peripheral participation in a learning community, then technology can support it. So we need theoretical concepts to be contextualized in real situations if we're going to understand them, and this is known as embodied cognition. We've got to do it and feel it before we really understand theoretical principles. But experiential learning in communities of mentors or peers develops that embodied cognition. So you're all working together on a task, and you're talking to each other and developing your understanding of what you're doing. There's a couple of little bits about memory and long-term memory and how we get things into long-term memory. So retrieval has to be effortful. We have to work hard to recall concepts because that helps to fix them in long-term memory. And then effortful retrieval can be promoted by spacing it out. So spacing recall, memorizing every so often, interleaving recall of different subjects. But the key things for me were it's effortful retrieval is really important. You need to have metacognition and you need regular testing. So you can't just You can't just have education. You need to actually test. You need formative assessment to see whether the student is learning anything. Okay, so moving over to the next slide, please. So the issues for flipped learning then, from what I've talked about so far, the human teacher is essential for discussion and feedback on divergent tasks where you don't have a single correct answer. And that would be things like formative writing tasks, but other things as well. And then the human teacher is essential to develop that metacognitive understanding, to explain what kind of thing we're learning here. But the computer can provide correct answers to convergent tasks, so things where there's only one right answer, grammar practice activities, for example. The peers can provide learning communities to develop embodied cognition, and that can be through the asynchronous activities I mentioned earlier, using discussion boards, using personal blogs with feedback on both of those from your peers. But then the teachers have to be prepared to let go. They have to give control of learning to computer-based materials and to students. Now, that's a hard ask. And many teachers prefer the face-to-face classroom where they feel, first of all, that they're in control, and secondly, that the interactions are somehow more real. And I do find that extraordinary, that somehow the interactions we're having on this computer today are not real. They feel real for me. So I'm going to move on to the last part of my talk. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my understanding of legitimation code theory, and I'm going to apologise in advance to those who already know and use this theory in their practice. I found this article by Ingold and Sullivan really useful and practical, and this is a quote from them. So to be successful, students have to be able to use meaning-packed, non-context dependent language, prove they understand it by unpacking it and grounding it in the real world. So in other words, they have to move from the general conceptual to the specific real world case or example. So next slide, please. So the two toolkits that are interesting to look at are semantic density, which is how much meaning does something contain. Semantics relates to the meaning. So things like plagiarism and scholarship are labels for complicated, complex concepts which contain a lot of meaning. So we would label that SD+. But then if we unpack those a little bit, copying the work of others or using your own voice, we've reduced the semantic density, and that would be SD-. And then semantic gravity, how close to a specific context you have to be to understand something. So that would be SG+. So for example, a specific task on your pre-sessional in your institution with your students is right down at the ground levels, SG+. And metacognitive understanding of task outcome to enable transfer to degree studies, well, that's higher up, that's at SG-. SG+ close to the ground because that's where the gravity is stronger. Okay, next slide, please. So the key thing with a legitimation code theory is you've got to wave. You've got to move between the general concepts that build metacognition and the examples and cases which enable embodied cognition. And you can see the two flat lines. If you just always stay within the cases and examples, the anecdotes, you never know what kind of thing it is you're talking about. But if you always stay at the general conceptual level, you never know how this works in the real world. So waving is important. Okay, next slide, please. So what I'm going to do is just do a little wave analysis of a lesson to show you the sorts of thing that it is. And it's the lesson that can be found following the link. It's a lesson on writer's voice. It looks at the procedural activating writer's voice. It looks at the analytical, actually analysing two student texts and seeing whether they exhibit good examples of writer's voice. And so I want to quote my co-author Sue Argent here. I love this quote. The most powerful and sustainable form of immunisation against plagiarism is the development of an academic writer's voice. And for me, that's the key. Let's stop talking about plagiarism and let's stop talking about paraphrasing, switching things around in a sentence. Let's actually look at the opposite side of the coin, and that's scholarship. So this is Unit 8, Section 4. It looks at writer's voice in two constructed student texts. And what I was able to do just quickly, I got permission from the teachers on our program in the summer to use recordings of this particular lesson which they had taught. It's in week 5 of the first 5 weeks of our pre-sessional course. It's also the task I use in recruiting teachers, so I expected that they would know what they were talking about. So when I talk about the experience of teachers, I've been looking at some of the recordings of this lesson that different teachers have taught. Okay, next slide, please. So I don't think I can, that's it, good. Okay, so I mentioned that we gave the students a preparation PowerPoint with a voiceover, and this is a little wave analysis of it. So the Study Smart is the metacognitive summary that occurs throughout the unit and this particular section. And we have a Study Smart that gives a little procedure for activating writer's voice, one for analysing essay titles, one for the components of writer's voice, and there's another one we don't need to talk about here. And we said take about 3 hours, 180 minutes. So this is a little wave across the tasks, which are down at the semantic gravity, the SG plus, and then the Study Smarts are up at SG minus. I'm not looking at SD at the moment. So what you can see here is that even in what I thought was a careful preparation of this PowerPoint, there were several transitions between different parts of the lesson which are only implicit. So the narrative of the lesson doesn't flow as well as it ought to, and this wave analysis has picked that out for me. So moving on to the next slide. So we gave a cut down version of that preparation PowerPoint to the teachers to use in a 50-minute lesson, and these are the lessons I've been able to look at. And so we left in some of the Study Smarts, but took some of them out. There were some keys to some of the tasks you can see highlighted there in green, and again the expected summary. But what you can see in the middle, across about a half of the lesson, is space where I hoped that the students would be able to discuss the procedures they'd worked through to activate writer's voice and the analysis of the two texts they were looking at. And that was going to be the core part of the lesson, I thought. Okay, moving on to the next slide. So the PowerPoint profile had the missing transitions, and I hope the teachers would be able to make those links. It had the answer keys and a space for student interaction. So what we've been finding when we look at the recorded lessons is the teachers don't make the transitions explicit between stages of the lesson, and they don't provide metacognitive summaries of the learning points. So perhaps I should have left those Study Smarts in, but I didn't do that. There was some really good use of the interactive affordances of the Collaborate classroom. So it has chat, it has emojis, it has polls and some breakout rooms. And the teachers very quickly, some of them were able to make use of those in a different way of interacting with their students. But actually what we found was that many teachers just read through the PowerPoint with very little interaction with the students. So it was a little bit like moving from general English to EAP. Often teacher talking time goes up. And here, moving from the typical classroom setting to the online setting, teacher talking time went up as well. And I think that might be a little bit about confidence. The teacher felt designed out of the materials. Perhaps what we should have done was not provided the Collaborate PowerPoint, the cut down version, but just given them the preparation one and said design your own lesson. So that one I'm not sure about. So I'm very quickly going to move to the next slide and show you a little bit some of the evaluations. I've cherry picked these, of course I have. Most students were very happy with what we'd done. They liked the 50-minute sessions, even when they were difficult they didn't always manage to access them. But we had a couple of what I think are very insightful comments. The first two there, learning in advance, reviewing, learning to summarize is the most effective. And what impressed me was to preview the homework in advance. It was this idea that they had something they really had to prepare. of course, the best thing I will remember is the teamwork and the teacher's patience. And then I put the last one in because you can see that with the best will in the world, you can't always make a huge amount of difference to a student's language. You know what this guy's talking about, but he's not put it into, or she has not put it into very accurate English. So moving to the next slide, please. So these were teacher evaluations actually from 2 teachers who'd had experience of teaching with us before and had taught their online classrooms. And so the first teacher felt that actually the time constraint was more conducive to the engagement in the community and the engagement of the students with the activities that they were doing. But then the second one was a very honest reflection about this, and this was a teacher who'd talked for a long time with us about this increase in teacher talking time. And he really struggled not to slip into this monologuing, as he called it. But he did feel that the learning moments came when he really insisted on input and spent time really pushing students to reflect on what they'd said. So that real challenge to students, which I think is what we would say. So my last slide, if we can move to that. Nearly the last slide, sorry. So the questions for reflection that I put up earlier. How well does our course design support learning? Well, our pass rate was pretty high. It was about 98%, and the student evaluation was generally positive. How well does it support transfer to degree studies? It does, I think, support embodied cognition through peer learning and assessment, but it requires the engagement of both teachers and students in the asynchronous aspects, and that wasn't always there. And then the metacognitive aspects definitely need to be improved, so that's highlighted as the key thing that we're doing. How well do the teachers understand the course design principles? Probably not that well. And so we have these recordings and we have this analysis using the legitimation code theory, which we can use at induction to say, well, here's the kind of thing that we're looking for. And I think that, again, that takes the teachers to the embodied cognition to get a sense of how we should do things. So moving on now to the last slide. I thought it was worth putting this up. I attended the Leeds SLO conference in July and August, which is a lovely opportunity to, as the Deputy Vice Chancellor of Student Education put it, it adapted to the needs of the circumstances and the audience. And you had, across 2 or 3 weeks, different talks and discussions. It was a really innovative way, I thought, of doing things. And these are the key things that came out for me, which I think have informed my thinking in this reflection today. So reflecting on evolving identities of teachers and students. We're not the same people online, and it's important to be aware of that. Challenging assumptions about communication face-to-face and online, and not assuming that online is necessarily inferior. Creating communities of practice so students feel safe, confident to contribute. That seems to me to be really, really important. And then valuing what students bring to their new education context. For example, a knowledge of their field. I sometimes feel in EAP that we assume the students come as empty vessels. They know nothing, but well, heck, they've studied at high school for 3 or 4 years if they're undergraduates, and they've perhaps been in work if they're postgraduates. And I think we should trust them more to take more ownership of what it is, of the carrier content of what they're going to study. So thank you very much then for this opportunity to talk to you, and I can now take any questions. The last slide contains my references.